bride's mother-in-law sold her for being sterile, but the Duke everyone desired chose her. The cramped salon above the gaming club reeked of cigar smoke and desperation. Helena Ward sat rigid in a corner chair, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Across from her, Lady Mildred Ward, her mother-in-law, leaned forward with the satisfied expression of someone closing a profitable business transaction. The man examining Helena like livestock, Mr. Caro, was a wealthy mill owner from the north, with cold eyes and colder calculations written across his face. "My son cannot pay his debts in coin," Mildred said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "But his wife, she's of no use to us now. Sterile, you understand, completely barren. You will cancel the debt, and she will go with you as housekeeper and companion." The words hit Helena like physical blows. She'd known this meeting was coming, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon, but hearing herself discussed as broken furniture still stole the breath from her lungs. Mr. Caro circled her slowly, his assessment thorough and humiliating. "She's well bred," he observed. "Knows her letters, can manage accounts." "Educated enough for a woman," Mildred replied dismissively. "She's kept my son's household running, despite her obvious failings. She'll serve your purposes adequately." Helena forced herself to breathe, to remain still, to not scream at the injustice of it all. Her husband George sat slumped in the corner, 3 glasses past drunk, letting his mother sell his wife without protest. The door opened without warning. Every head turned as Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Evermere, entered the salon with the unconscious authority of someone who'd never needed to announce himself. He was tall, perhaps late 30s, with dark hair silvered slightly at the temples and eyes that missed nothing. Helena had seen him once before, months ago, at a charity musicale, though she doubted he'd remember. The room seemed to shrink around his presence. "Caro," Alexander said, his voice pleasant but carrying an edge. "I was told we had business to discuss regarding the Manchester Mill investment. I wasn't aware there would be additional parties present." Mr. Caro straightened, suddenly uncertain. "Your Grace, this is a private family matter being concluded. We can discuss our business after." Alexander's gaze swept the room, taking in Mildred's satisfied expression, George's drunken stupor, and Helena's pale, controlled face. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, and something shifted in his expression. "Your Grace," Mildred said sharply, "we are concluding a private arrangement. My son's wife is no longer suitable as a bride. She's proven herself barren after 2 years of marriage. She will be better used elsewhere." The casualness with which Mildred discussed her failings, her worthlessness, her complete lack of value, made Helena want to disappear into the wallpaper. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He moved further into the room, his attention now fully focused on Helena. "Lady Helena," he said quietly, and she was shocked he knew her name. "Do you consent to this arrangement?" The question hung in the air like a grenade. No one had asked for her consent. No one had asked her anything. Helena started, her voice rough from disuse. "I have little choice, Your Grace. My husband's debts must be paid, and I am the only asset remaining." Alexander's expression hardened. He turned to face Mildred and Caro with the full weight of his ducal authority. "If Lady Helena is being sold," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the small room, "then I'll make my own offer, not as a servant or companion, as my wife." The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. Helena's heart stopped. Mildred's face went purple with rage. Caro sputtered in indignation. George looked up from his glass with confused, bloodshot eyes. "Your Grace," Mildred recovered first, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Surely you jest. This woman is damaged goods, proven sterile. You need an heir, and she cannot provide one." "I'm aware of what I need, Lady Ward," Alexander replied coolly. "And it isn't your assessment of Lady Helena's worth." He looked directly at Helena again. "The choice, of course, is yours, my lady, but I offer it genuinely. Marriage, not servitude." Helena stood abruptly, fury finally overwhelming humiliation. Her voice, when it emerged, was steady and cold. "I will not be passed from debtor to duke like a parcel, your grace. I belong to no one. Not to this family who's treated me like livestock, and not to you, no matter how noble your intentions." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but she couldn't stop them. "I am not so desperate that I need to be rescued by a stranger who happened to walk into the wrong room at the right time." Alexander didn't flinch. Instead, something that might have been respect flickered across his face. "That is precisely why I'm here, my lady," he said quietly. "To see you treated as a person, not a possession, whether you ever choose me or not." Helena stared at him, searching his face for mockery or pity or the calculating look men got when they saw an opportunity. She found none of those things, only sincerity and something else she couldn't quite name. In that moment, surrounded by people who'd reduced her to her womb's functionality, this stranger was the only one in the room who actually seemed to see her. 2 years earlier, Helena had entered the Ward household with modest hopes and practical expectations. She'd married George Ward to secure her younger siblings' futures. Her small dowry, just enough to pay for her brother's commission and her sister's education. George had seemed kind enough during their brief courtship, charming when sober, eager to please. His mother Mildred had been coolly welcoming, and Helena had believed she could build something real from this practical foundation. The Ward townhouse in London was respectable but slowly decaying, like the family itself. Helena threw herself into being a good wife and daughter-in-law. She reorganized the household accounts, discovering George's tendency toward expensive brandy and questionable card games. She softened his temper when he came home frustrated. She tried, genuinely tried, to love him. There were moments of warmth those first few months. George teaching her to ride in Hyde Park, both of them laughing when she nearly fell off. Helena sharing a burnt pudding disaster with the kitchen maid, both doubled over with giggles while Mildred frowned from the doorway. But underlying everything was the pressure. The unspoken expectation that had driven the marriage in the first place. George needed an heir to access his trust fund. Mildred needed a grandson to secure the family's social position. Helena needed to prove her worth by producing a child within the first year, as any proper wife should. When her monthly courses came the first time after the wedding, Mildred had merely pursed her lips. The second time, she'd made a small comment about Helena's health. By the 6th month, the comments had grown sharper. "Some women are simply barren, my dear," Mildred said over breakfast one morning, her voice carrying the false sympathy of someone enjoying another's misfortune. "We must pray you are not one of them." Helena had smiled tightly and excused herself, then spent the afternoon in her room tracking her cycle obsessively in a small notebook. She consulted every book on conception she could find. She choked down foul-tasting herbal teas that the housekeeper swore would help. She prayed, though she wasn't sure anyone was listening. After a year, with no pregnancy, everything shifted. George's gambling grew worse, his drinking heavier. He'd come home at dawn, smelling of cards and perfume and rage, and he'd stopped coming to her bed entirely. Mildred moved Helena to a smaller, colder bedroom so she could rest properly. The servants began whispering when she passed. Invitations to social events dried up. Helena felt herself shrinking inside the house, becoming smaller and quieter and more invisible with each passing day. Dr. Latham came to examine her at Mildred's insistence. He was an overworked, kind-eyed man who seemed uncomfortable with the entire situation. "There's no clear indication of any problem, Lady Helena," he told her gently, after an examination that left her feeling exposed and humiliated. These things often take time. But when Helena asked if George should also be examined, Dr. Latham had grown evasive. "That would be highly unusual," he'd said carefully, "and likely unwelcome." It was at a charity musicale that Helena first truly saw Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Evermere. She'd been standing in a corner, trying to remain unnoticed while Mildred socialized, when a young orphan boy had dropped a tray of glasses. The crash silenced the room. The child had frozen in terror, while ladies lifted their skirts away from the spill and gentlemen frowned in irritation. Helena had moved without thinking, kneeling beside the boy and speaking softly while helping him pick up the glass. "It's all right," she'd murmured. "Everyone makes mistakes." When she'd looked up, the Duke of Evermere had been watching her. He'd crossed the room and helped gather the remaining shards, his expensive coat brushing the floor without apparent concern. "Nicely handled," he'd said to Helena. Their conversation had been brief, polite, nothing remarkable. But she'd noticed the kindness in his eyes when he'd pressed a coin into the orphan's trembling hand and told him not to worry. Later, in the carriage home, Mildred had noticed Helena's distraction. "Don't waste your smiles on widowers who refuse to remarry," she'd hissed. "The Duke of Evermere is the most sought-after man in London, and he'd never look twice at a woman like you." Months later, Dr. Latham had sent a letter suggesting a private consultation. He'd written carefully, hinting that perhaps Helena wasn't the source of the problem, that there were other factors to consider. The letter had arrived while Helena was out walking. Mildred had intercepted it, read it, and burned it in the drawing-room fire. When Helena returned, Mildred had been waiting with a new story already constructed. "Dr. Latham has confirmed it," she'd announced to the household. "Helena is barren. It's a tragedy, but these things happen." Helena had stood frozen, knowing it was a lie, but unable to prove it without the letter. Unable to fight against Mildred's authority and George's cowardice. She'd watched her worth evaporate in that moment, watched herself transform from wife to burden, from woman to broken thing. The next 18 months had been a slow descent into invisibility and shame, until the night she'd found herself sitting in that smoke-filled salon, being sold to pay George's gambling debts. Until the moment a duke she barely knew had walked through the door and offered her a choice instead of another transaction. 2. The chaos in the cramped salon had continued for another hour after Alexander's stunning offer. Caro had blustered about breach of agreement. Mildred had alternated between outrage and calculating reassessment. George had simply refilled his glass and watched the proceedings with the detached interest of someone watching a play. Through it all, Alexander had remained maddeningly calm, his attention occasionally drifting back to Helena with an expression she couldn't quite read. "This is absurd," Caro had finally declared. "I came here for a business arrangement, not a bidding war over damaged merchandise." The casual cruelty of his words had made Helena flinch. Alexander's expression had turned glacial. "Lady Helena is not merchandise, damaged or otherwise. She is a person who deserves to be treated as such. Now, shall we discuss this matter rationally, or shall I simply settle Mr. Ward's debts in full and remove both problems from your consideration?" The mention of money had silenced the room. Alexander had turned to Helena, his voice gentler. "Lady Helena, if you'll permit me a private word?" She'd wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her dignity and independence. But the alternative was returning to the Ward household or being shipped north with Caro, and both options made her skin crawl. She'd nodded stiffly and followed Alexander to a quieter corner of the room. "I don't know you," Helena had said bluntly, keeping her voice low. "Why would you do this?" Alexander had studied her for a long moment. "I remember you," he'd said finally, "from the musicale months ago. You were the only person in that entire room who saw that frightened child as someone worth helping. While everyone else stepped back to protect their hems and their reputations, you knelt in broken glass to comfort him." Helena had blinked, surprised he'd noticed such a small moment. "That's hardly reason to offer marriage." "Perhaps not," Alexander had agreed. "But I also heard from a mutual acquaintance, Dr. Latham, that you've been conveniently blamed for your husband's failings, that the diagnosis of your sterility was never medically confirmed, only socially declared." Helena's breath had caught. "How did you know?" "Because I make it my business to know the truth before making investments," Alexander had replied, "and I've invested in several of Caro's ventures." When he mentioned acquiring a Barren titled lady as part of a debt settlement, I made inquiries. The revelation had left Helena reeling. All this time, she'd believed herself broken, defective, worthless. And someone had known the truth but allowed the lie to persist. "So you're offering marriage out of pity," she'd said bitterly, "because you feel sorry for the wronged wife." "No," Alexander had corrected, his voice firm. "I'm offering because I've been hounded for 5 years to remarry and produce an heir, and I've refused every eligible woman in London because none of them saw me as anything beyond a title and a breeding opportunity. The world may value your womb, Lady Helena. I value your spine." The words had struck something deep in Helena's chest. Before she could respond, Alexander had continued, "I'm not asking you to marry me today. I'm asking if you'd accept my help to leave this situation with your dignity and independence intact. I have a small house in London where you could stay, properly chaperoned by my aunt. No obligations, no demands, just a safe place while you decide what you want your life to look like." Helena had searched his face for deception or ulterior motives. She'd found only steady sincerity. "Society will assume I'm your mistress," she'd said quietly. "They'll say worse things than they already do." "Society," Alexander had replied dryly, "can assume whatever it likes. I stopped caring about their opinions when they suggested I marry my late wife's 17-year-old cousin 6 months after the funeral. The question is whether you're willing to tolerate their gossip in exchange for freedom from this." She'd looked past him at the room beyond. At Mildred negotiating her disposal like a broken chair. At George drowning himself in brandy. At Caro waiting to claim his human property. Then she'd looked back at Alexander and saw possibility instead of transaction. "Yes," Helena had whispered. "Yes, I accept your help. But I want to be clear, Your Grace. I'm not agreeing to marriage. I'm agreeing to space, to breathe and think." "That's all I'm offering," Alexander had assured her. Within the hour, he'd paid George's debts in full with the cold efficiency of someone writing a grocery list. He'd negotiated Helena's complete legal separation from the Ward family, ensuring they had no further claim on her person or her dowry remnants. Caro had left grumbling about aristocratic interference. Mildred had oscillated between fury at losing her bargaining chip and satisfaction at being rid of Helena entirely. George had simply nodded when Alexander had coldly informed him that he'd lost any right to call Helena his wife. Helena had left the Ward household that night with a single bag of belongings and Alexander's elegant carriage waiting outside. She hadn't looked back at the house that had been her prison for 2 years. As the carriage rolled through London's dark streets, Alexander had maintained polite distance on the opposite seat. "My aunt, Lady Beatrice, lives at the house on Portman Square," he'd explained. "She's a widow, somewhat eccentric, but kind. She'll ensure everything is proper and above reproach." "Will she mind?" Helena had asked, having a scandalous charity case thrust upon her. Alexander had smiled slightly. "Beatrice has been begging me for years to do something interesting. I suspect she'll be delighted." The house on Portman Square had been modest by aristocratic standards, but felt like a palace after the Ward townhouse. Lady Beatrice Linwood had met them at the door, a tiny woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and sharper wit. She'd taken one look at Helena's pale, exhausted face and immediately wrapped her in a fierce hug. "That Mildred Ward is a viper," Beatrice had declared. "I've known her for 40 years, and she's always been dreadful. Come in, dear girl. Let's get you fed and warm, and then you can sleep for a week if you need to." Helena had nearly wept at the simple kindness. That first week in the Portman Square house had been a revelation. Her own room with a real fire and soft blankets, meals that appeared without her having to plan or account for them. Lady Beatrice's constant stream of commentary on everyone from the prince to the butcher's boy, delivered with such humour that Helena found herself laughing for the first time in months. Alexander had visited daily, but kept careful distance. He'd brought books from his library that he thought she might enjoy. He'd discussed estate business and asked her opinion on investments as if her thoughts actually mattered. He'd introduced her to his enormous, badly behaved dog Zeus, who'd immediately claimed Helena as his favourite person and refused to leave her side. "He has excellent judgment," Alexander had observed dryly, watching Zeus drool contentedly on Helena's lap. 3 weeks into her stay, Helena had ventured into Alexander's study to return a book and found him reorganizing his library in what appeared to be complete chaos. "What are you doing?" she'd asked, staring at stacks of books covering every surface. "Reorganizing," Alexander had replied, not looking up. "By what system? Madness." Helena had picked up a volume on crop rotation, sitting next to a book of poetry. "There's no logic to this at all." "There's perfect logic," Alexander had protested. "Books I've read recently go here. Books I intend to read soon go there. Reference volumes stay on the bottom shelf." "That's not organization," Helena had said, unable to help herself. "That's barely controlled chaos." Alexander had finally looked up, his eyes bright with amusement. "Do you have a better system?" "Alphabetically, by author within subject categories," Helena had replied immediately. Like any rational person, they'd argued good-naturedly for 20 minutes before Lady Beatrice had found them surrounded by books, both talking over each other about the proper way to organise literature. "Well," Beatrice had said, delighted, "this is the most animated I've seen either of you in weeks. Please continue. I'll watch from here with my tea." Helena had felt her cheeks heat, but Alexander had simply laughed and suggested they test both systems on one shelf to see which worked better. One evening, after a particularly pleasant dinner where they'd debated the merits of Gothic novels, Alexander had grown serious. They'd retired to the drawing room, and he'd asked Lady Beatrice for a moment alone with Helena. When they were seated by the fire, Alexander had chosen his words carefully. "I need to be honest with you about my intentions," he'd said. "I would like to court you properly, Helena, with absolutely no pressure about children or heirs." Helena's heart had stuttered at the use of her first name, "Your Grace." "Alexander," he'd corrected gently. "Please." She'd taken a breath. "Alexander, you need an heir. Everyone knows that. You're a duke. Your line requires continuation." "My line has 3 possible heirs through various cousins," Alexander had replied. If necessary, I'll name one of them. Or I'll support foundling hospitals and schools. Or fund adoptions. I have options that don't require reducing a wife to a breeding mare. He'd leaned forward, his expression intense. My first wife died in childbirth, Helena. She and our son both gone within hours. I spent 5 years being told I needed to try again, needed to replace them, needed to fulfill my duty, as if Marianne and Thomas were simply failed attempts at an heir. His voice had roughed with old pain. I won't build another marriage on that foundation. I want a partner, not a womb with a title attached. If we marry, it will be despite what society says about your fertility, not because of it. Helena had felt tears threatening. You barely know me. Then let me know you. Alexander had said simply, no rush, no demands, just time to see if we suit each other. Helena had wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to fall into the safety and respect he offered. But wariness had held her back. She'd been someone's project before, someone's disappointing investment. I need to go slowly, she'd said finally. I need to know this isn't just you trying to make a point against society's expectations. Take all the time you need, Alexander had agreed. They'd settled into a careful courtship after that. Walks in the park with Lady Beatrice as chaperone. Long conversations about everything from politics to literature, to whether Zeus needed a companion dog. Quiet dinners where Alexander made her laugh with stories of parliamentary disasters. Helena felt herself relaxing in ways she'd never managed with George. Felt herself emerging from the shell she'd built during her first marriage. But society hadn't been kind. Gossip spread that the Duke of Evermere was keeping the Barren Ward woman as his mistress. That he'd gone mad, wasting his time on damaged goods when he could have any eligible young woman in England. Helena had heard the whispers at church, had seen the knowing looks when she and Alexander appeared together. It hurt more than she'd expected, but Alexander's steady presence made it bearable. Then, 2 months after she'd left the Ward household, the letter arrived. George and Mildred were petitioning for a formal annulment of the marriage, publicly declaring Helena barren and demanding ecclesiastical recognition of the marriage's failure. It was a calculated move designed to cement their story, to ensure Helena could never challenge their version of events. Lady Beatrice had found Helena in her room, staring at the legal documents with shaking hands. What will you do? Beatrice had asked, gently. Helena had looked up, her jaw set with new determination. I'm going to fight, she'd said. I'm going to make them tell the truth for once, even if it destroys me. Alexander, when she'd told him, had simply nodded and said, Then we fight together, and it won't destroy you, Helena. It's going to free you. 3. The formal inquiry was held in a private chamber at the College of Physicians, a wood-panelled room that smelled of old books and ancient prejudices. Present were Dr. Latham as expert witness, a panel of 3 physicians to review the evidence, George and Mildred with their solicitor, and Helena with Alexander standing supportively behind her chair. Lady Beatrice had fought to attend, but been denied on grounds of impropriety, much to her vocal displeasure. The chief physician, Dr. Pemberton, was an elderly man with impressive whiskers and the authoritative bearing of someone unaccustomed to being questioned. He'd reviewed the submitted documents with pursed lips before looking up at the assembled group. We are here to examine Lady Helena Ward's petition to contest the medical diagnosis of sterility that has been used as grounds for marital annulment. Lady Ward, you claim this diagnosis was rendered in error? Helena's voice came out steady despite her racing heart. I claim it was never rendered at all, sir. Lady Mildred Ward declared me barren without medical confirmation, and that lie has been used to destroy my reputation and my marriage." Mildred's face went purple. "How dare you, Doctor? Latham himself confirmed your condition." Dr. Latham, seated uncomfortably to the side, cleared his throat. "That is, I'm afraid, inaccurate, Lady Ward." The room went silent. Dr. Pemberton leaned forward. "Dr. Latham, please elaborate." Latham pulled out a worn medical journal, his notes from Helena's examinations. "I examined Lady Helena Ward 3 times during her marriage at Lady Mildred Ward's insistence. At no time did I find evidence of infertility. In fact, I found no evidence of any reproductive abnormality whatsoever." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I sent a letter to Lady Helena, suggesting that if the marriage remained childless, perhaps Mr. George Ward should also be examined, as male infertility is far more common than generally acknowledged." "This is outrageous," Mildred's solicitor interjected. "Are you suggesting Mr. Ward is somehow deficient?" "I'm suggesting," Dr. Latham said firmly, "that I privately examined Mr. Ward at his request 6 months ago, after he began to suspect the problem might not lie with his wife. My findings indicated that a severe illness he'd suffered 3 years prior, combined with excessive alcohol consumption, had very likely compromised his fertility." George, who'd been staring at the floor, looked up with haunted eyes. Dr. Pemberton frowned. "You examined Mr. Ward. Do you have documentation?" Dr. Latham produced another journal. "I do, Mr. Ward swore me to secrecy at the time, threatened to ruin my practice if I revealed the results. But I've decided that protecting one man's pride is less important than clearing an innocent woman's name." The 3 physicians reviewed the notes with increasing interest. One of them, a younger man named Dr. Mills, spoke up. "These findings are quite clear. Mr. Ward's condition would make conception extremely unlikely. Why was this information suppressed?" "Because," Helena said quietly, standing despite protocol, "it was easier to blame me. A woman's worth in society is measured by her womb. A man's reputation can survive questions about fertility. Mine could not." Her voice strengthened. "For 2 years, I was told I was broken, defective, useless. I believed it because everyone around me insisted it must be true. I blamed myself for every disappointed look, every cruel comment, every moment I felt less than human." She turned to face George directly. "But it was never me, was it? You knew the truth and let your mother destroy me rather than admit your own failing." George couldn't meet her eyes. Mildred stood abruptly. "This is all speculation and lies from a vindictive woman who couldn't fulfill her most basic duty." "Her duty?" Alexander's voice cut across the room like a blade. He'd remained silent until now, but his restraint had clearly reached its limit. "Lady Helena's duty was to be treated as a human being with dignity and respect. Instead, she was examined like livestock, declared worthless, and nearly sold to a stranger to settle your son's gambling debts." Dr. Pemberton's eyebrows rose. "Sold? 3 months ago?" Alexander continued, his fury barely controlled. "I personally witnessed Lady Mildred Ward negotiating to transfer Lady Helena to a mill owner named Caro in exchange for debt forgiveness. Lady Helena was being treated as property, not as a person with legal rights. I intervened and settled Mr. Ward's debts myself to prevent this unconscionable transaction." The physicians exchanged shocked glances. Dr. Mills spoke up again. "Your Grace, can you provide evidence of this?" "I can provide Mr. Caro's signed agreement releasing Mr. Ward from debt in exchange for domestic service from Lady Helena Ward," Alexander replied coldly. "I can provide statements from 3 witnesses who were present, and I can provide Dr. Latham's testimony that he attempted to prevent this very situation by suggesting Mr. Ward seek examination, only to be threatened into silence. The inquiry lasted another 2 hours. Dr. Latham provided detailed medical testimony. George, under pressure, finally admitted he'd known about his own condition and allowed his mother to blame Helena. Mildred maintained her position that Helena had failed in her wifely duties, but her credibility crumbled under questioning. When Dr. Pemberton finally called for a recess to review the evidence, Helena felt simultaneously exhausted and electrified. In the antechamber, Alexander found her staring out a window at London's grey sky. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. Helena shook her head. "I was terrified. Courage." Alexander replied, "Is being terrified and doing it anyway." They stood together in silence, not touching but close enough that Helena could feel his solid presence beside her. "Whatever happens," Alexander said finally, "you've already won. You spoke your truth. You stood up for yourself. That matters more than any verdict." When the inquiry reconvened, Dr. Pemberton delivered the panel's findings with judicial precision. Based on the medical evidence presented, we find no support for the claim that Lady Helena Ward is sterile or infertile. We find that Mr. George Ward was aware of his own compromised fertility and allowed his wife to be blamed unjustly. We recommend that the petition for annulment be granted on grounds of cruelty and abandonment, not infertility. He looked directly at Mildred. Furthermore, we find Lady Mildred Ward's conduct in spreading false medical information and attempting to transfer custody of Lady Helena to be unconscionable. We will be reporting this matter to the appropriate social authorities. Mildred's face went white. The social disgrace would be complete. Her carefully constructed reputation was crumbling in real time. Lady Helena Ward, Dr. Pemberton continued, is hereby cleared of all aspersions on her character and fertility. The annulment will be processed with full acknowledgement that the failure of the marriage lay with her husband's deception, not her person. Helena felt tears streaming down her face. Not tears of shame this time, but of vindication, of freedom. George approached her as the room began to clear, his expression hollow. "Helena, he started, then stopped. "I'm sorry, for all of it. I was weak and afraid, and you paid the price." "Yes," Helena said simply. "I did." She didn't offer forgiveness. She didn't have it in her to give, not yet. "I hope you learn to be honest with the next woman you hurt, if there is one." She walked away without looking back, leaving George standing alone with his regrets. Outside, Lady Beatrice was waiting with Alexander's carriage. She pulled Helena into a fierce hug. "I knew you had steel in you. The girl, I knew it the moment I saw you." As they rode back to Portman Square, Helena felt something loosening in her chest, some tightness she'd carried for so long that she'd stopped noticing its weight. She was free. Legally, socially, emotionally free. For the first time in her adult life, she belonged only to herself. That evening, after dinner, Alexander found her in the garden behind the Portman Square house. The spring air was cool and sweet, and Helena was simply standing in the fading light, breathing deeply. "Helena?" Alexander said softly. She turned to face him. "I need to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to answer honestly, without considering my feelings or what you think you should say." "All right," Helena agreed, her heart beginning to race. "Would you consider marrying me?" The question hung between them in the twilight. Helena studied his face, searching for any hint of pity or obligation, or the need to complete his rescue project. She found only openness and affection, and a question that gave her all the power to answer. I have conditions, she said finally. Alexander smiled. I would expect nothing less. I want my own income, Helena began. Administered by me, not by you or any male relative. I want a say in estate management and business decisions. I want absolute honesty between us, always, even when it's uncomfortable. She took a breath. And I want it understood that if I can never have children, or if I choose not to risk pregnancy, that doesn't make me less valuable as your wife. Agreed to all of it, Alexander said without hesitation. Do you have more conditions? Just one, Helena said softly. I want to be certain you're choosing me for who I am, not for who you hope I might become or what I represent in your fight against society's expectations. Alexander closed the distance between them, his hands finding hers. Helena Ward, I am choosing you because you're brave and intelligent and sharp-tongued. Because you make me laugh and argue with me about library organization and treat scared children with kindness. Because you saw me as a person before you ever saw me as a duke. I don't hope you'll become anything. You're already exactly who I want. Helena felt the last of her wariness dissolve. Then yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you, Alexander Hawthorne. He kissed her then, gently, reverently, like she was something precious he'd been afraid he might never hold. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. We should tell Beatrice, Helena said. She'll want to start planning immediately. God help us, Alexander muttered, but he was grinning. They married 6 weeks later, in a quiet ceremony at Alexander's country estate, Evermere. Only close friends and family attended. Lady Beatrice wept openly, which she loudly insisted was due to allergies. Zeus the dog served as an unofficial ring-bearer and knocked over 2 flower arrangements. Helena wore cream silk instead of white, a choice that scandalized some but felt honest to her. Alexander stood at the altar, looking at her like she'd hung the stars. For the first year of marriage to Alexander was nothing like Helena's first marriage, and everything she'd secretly hoped a partnership could be. They settled into a rhythm at Evermere, the sprawling country estate that Alexander clearly loved far more than London. Helena threw herself into learning estate management, discovering she had a natural aptitude for organization and efficiency that Alexander cheerfully admitted surpassed his own. You've reduced our household expenses by 15%, Alexander observed one evening, reviewing the quarterly accounts Helena had reorganized. How did you manage that? Your previous housekeeper was being overcharged by 3 vendors, who assumed a duke wouldn't notice. Helena replied, not looking up from her ledger. And you were purchasing from London suppliers when local sources were both cheaper and better quality. Alexander leaned back in his chair, watching her work with obvious affection. You're magnificent, do you know that? Helena glanced up, her cheeks warming. I'm practical. There's a difference. No, Alexander said firmly. You're magnificent and practical. Both can be true. They'd fallen into easy domesticity that felt revolutionary in its ordinariness. Breakfast together where they debated the morning papers. Long walks through Evermere's grounds with Zeus bounding ahead. Evenings reading in the library, often migrating to the same sofa without quite acknowledging when they'd started automatically gravitating toward each other. I'm so happy you came into my life, he said. Are you now? She teased. Of course. He pulled her into his arms and arrested her lips with a kiss that communicated every beat of his affection.